2024 will be the 49th anniversary of the conclusion of the Vietnam War, and the ripple effects it's had on people throughout the entire world are still felt to this day. Welcome back to Bumblebee, I'm Ethan, and here's 10 messed up stories from the Vietnam War. 3 missing Marines. When the United States fled Vietnam on April 30th, 1975, it had signified the official end of the Vietnam War. But yet, less than 2 weeks later, on May 12th, 1975, the Khmer Rouge, or Cambodia's communist regime, commandeered an American cargo ship, dragging the USA right back in. And so the US began a rescue mission to get their ship back. But the entire operation has been shrouded in mystery and uncertainty, including 3 Marines who've straight up disappeared. In order to get this ship back, 100 Marine reinforcements were sent to the Cambodian island of Koh Tang. But here's the weird thing. The ship and its crew had already been recovered. Yet in preparation, the reinforcements were informed they would face up to 40 old men and farmers. Instead, when they arrived, around 200 battle-ready people awaited them. And to make matters worse, using information from interviews and declassified documents, it was revealed that defense officials knew in advance about the fighters, but nobody told the Marines. Now comes the disappearances. Gary Hall, Joseph Hargrove, and Danny Marshall, all Marines, were unaccounted for, and the US military maintains that they disobeyed orders by not making it to the helicopters in time and had likely lost their lives. While Khmer Rouge commanders have said they captured and ended the lives of these 3, expeditions into the area have found nothing about them. And now, to this day, no one knows what happened to Gary Hall, Joseph Hargrove, and Danny Marshall. At number 9, we have Agent Orange. 2 years before these 3 disappeared in Cambodia, the last GI to lose their life directly in combat in Vietnam perished in 1973. 11 hours after, the Paris Peace Accords were signed and a ceasefire commenced. But even though the combat directly didn't end lives anymore, it had done a huge toll on Cambodia's soil and would create humongous challenges for those living there. An article from 2017 by The Conversation revealed that between 1961 and 1971, the US showered Vietnam with around 73 million liters of chemical agents, which they said would be to strip away the vegetation that gave Viet Cong soldiers cover. And while it might have been effective, 45 million liters of these chemicals were Agent Orange, which has impacted people in Vietnam to this day. Not only were 50% of Vietnam's mangrove forests decimated, the US Department of Veterans Affairs lists 14 different diseases, including Parkinson's and 7 kinds of cancer, linked to Agent Orange exposure. But it gets worse. A 2003 article by The Guardian revealed that the Agent Orange used was 25% more potent than the country's own guidelines suggested it would be. The United States has attempted to aid those who suffered illnesses from the pesticide, as in 1979 a class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of 2.4 million veterans who were exposed to Agent Orange during their service in Vietnam. 5 years later, in an out-of-court settlement, 7 large chemical companies that manufactured the herbicide agreed to pay $180 million in compensation to the veterans or their next of kin. And unfortunately, no such plan has been created in Vietnam. At number 8, we have the Tiger Force. There are plenty of troops from Vietnam who've had their names remembered for their actions, but almost none are as memorable as the Tiger Force. They were a specialized unit of the US Army's 101st Airborne Division. It was officially known as the Reconnaissance Platoon of the 1st Battalion, 327th Infantry Regiment, 1st Brigade, 101st Airborne Division. The unit operated mainly from 1967 to 1971. While the unit was tasked with gathering information and disrupting enemy transmissions, the group turned loss of life into their way of life, getting to the point where almost every member had a necklace of ears. And yes, that's exactly what it sounds like. It took until years after the war had ended for the majority of crimes this unit committed to come to the forefront, and former members have gone on the record talking about how they lost track of just how many people were slain by their hands. At times it didn't matter if they were enemy or innocent. In 2003, the Toledo Blade released a story saying the helpless victims of the unit were in the hundreds, but the 18 people found as culprits, none of them have faced any consequences. At number 7, we have the Mei Massacre. But this wasn't the only case of mass innocents losing their lives. Charlie Company, a unit of the American military's 23rd Infantry Division, was tasked with carrying out a search and destroy mission in the My Lai hamlet of South Vietnam. Soldiers were sent to the area to root out Viet Cong insurgents and their supporters. However, the mission turned into a horrific massacre. Instead of engaging enemy combatants, the soldiers, under the command of Lieutenant William Cowie, began indiscriminately targeting unarmed civilians, rounding up villagers, herding them into ditches, and executing them. The exact number of casualties is still a matter of debate. Estimates suggest that it's between 347 to 504 who lost their lives. Initially, the incident was covered up, but eventually accounts of the massacre began to surface. Investigations and reports by journalists, particularly the work of investigative journalist Seymour Hersh, led to widespread public outrage and condemnation. In the aftermath, several soldiers were charged and faced court-martial for their roles. William Cowie in particular was court-martialed, found guilty of murder, and initially sentenced to life in prison. However, his sentence was later reduced reduced, as he served only a few years under house arrest. Number 6, we have tiger cages. For the South Vietnamese forces, they needed something to deal with the mass number of prisoners they had detained from Viet Cong forces, amongst other things. What they decided upon were what's been dubbed the tiger cages, some of the smallest cells humans have been kept in. First shared to the masses over 50 years ago by Life magazine, these cages were identified as being in Con Jiao prison and were 5 feet by 9 feet. And while not everyone was housed inside these, overall conditions of Con Jiao prison were horrific. And what made this worse was the fact that the US helped fund this, and advisors wouldn't stop the torment that was unfolding. For years they funded these inhumane prisons, and when the war ended, US police and prison advisors to Vietnam were sent packing. By the end of 1973, due to mass protests about the tiger cages amongst other things, Congress voted to shut down the Office of Public Safety, which operated all the US assistance programs to police and prisons of other countries. At number 5, we have the Amir Asians. Fleeing Vietnam not only had an impact on the soldiers, it also left tons of Amir Asians without a father. Well, who are Amir Asians? The Amir Asians, who were born to Vietnamese mothers and American fathers, faced significant challenges due to the circumstances of their birth and aftermath of the war. Amir Asians often faced discrimination and societal stigma in Vietnam. They were sometimes seen as symbols of the war and its aftermath, and they encountered difficulties in being fully accepted by either American or Vietnamese society. Many faced poverty, lack of access to education, healthcare, and other basic needs. In fact, they were called children of the dust, earning that title because they viewed them as insignificant as a speck to be brushed aside. No one knows how many Amir Asians were born and ultimately left behind in Vietnam, but as per recent records, it seems the majority are now residing in the United States. The US assisted in bringing them over 10 years after the war ended by enacting the Amir Asian Homecoming Act of 1987. This helped Amir Asians and their families by allowing them to immigrate to the United States and providing them with support, including access to education, healthcare, and citizenship rights. But that didn't stop the years of trauma and the fact that the majority were left without family or an ability to speak the language in their new home country. Now, organizations like Amir Asians Without Borders aim to bring the remaining ones home to the United States and set them up with their families. But the work isn't done yet. At number 4, we have the Tet Offensive. There were multiple events that lowered Americans' faith in the United States' involvement in Vietnam, and one of those was how they handled the Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive was a significant military campaign launched by the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army beginning on January 30th, 1968. It has its name because it occurred during the Vietnamese New Year holiday known as Tet, which is a traditional period of ceasefire and celebration in Vietnam. The offensive was a coordinated series of surprise attacks across South Vietnam, targeting cities, towns, and military installations. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army launched simultaneous assaults on more than 100 towns and cities, including the capital of Saigon, which is now Ho Chi Minh City, and the ancient city of Hue. What separated it was that the attacks during the Tet Offensive were a departure from the usual hit-and-run guerrilla tactics employed by the Viet Cong. This offensive aimed to strike multiple targets simultaneously, causing confusion, weakening South Vietnamese and American forces, and sparking a general uprising amongst the South Vietnamese population. The offensive initially took the forces by surprise, and the scale and scope of the attack challenged the belief held by many Americans that the Vietnam War was being won. While the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces achieved some tactical success and captured several key locations temporarily, this offensive ultimately did not result in a military victory for the communist forces, but it led to tons more protests and Lyndon B. Johnson not seeking re-election, which resulted in Richard Nixon taking power. At number 3, we have Nixon nixing a trial. When Nixon took power in 1969, he publicly pledged to diminish America's involvement in the Vietnam War, and then he orchestrated devastating bombings in Cambodia while aiming to keep this operation concealed, even if it necessitated curtailing a murder trial before it commenced. During that year, the Green Berets, engaged in a covert mission to evaluate the efficiency of the Cambodia bombings, encountered an unsettling revelation. Thai Kak Kwan, suspected of being a communist spy, was a disconcerting figure amongst their ranks. Despite enduring 3 days of intensive interrogation that failed to elicit a confession, Chuan was executed by 3 berets, purportedly for betrayal. This act concluded with his body being disposed of in a murky body of water concealed from view. The exposure of this was instigated by his wife, who, aided by General harboring disdain for the Green Berets, brought the truth to light. Although 8 men faced charges for the crime, Nixon, seeking to bury the incident, exerted pressure to have the case dismissed. Ultimately, a congressman intervened in Nixon's favor, leveraging the threat of halting defense funding unless the army halted proceedings on the grounds of national security. And then, court proceedings were terminated under the guise of safeguarding national interests. However, the unraveling of this cover-up was set in motion by military analyst journalist Daniel Ellsberg. Ellsberg eventually leaked the Pentagon Papers revealing the egregious deception perpetrated by the government throughout the Vietnam War, which included the suppressed truth behind Nixon's actions. At number 2, we have the Battle of Hamburger Hill. 5 months into Nixon's presidency, and the US was still involved, with one major event being the Battle of Hamburger Hill. Also known as the Battle of Hill 937, it was a significant and fiercely contested battle that took place from May 10th to May 20th, 1969, in the A Shau Valley of South Vietnam. The battle was part of Operation Apache Snow, a mission conducted by US forces with the objective of seizing Hill 937, a strategically insignificant but heavily fortified hill held by the North Vietnamese army. The hill was dubbed Hamburger Hill due to the intense fighting and high casualty rates experienced by the American forces. The assault was launched by the 101st Airborne Division, and it quickly escalated into a brutal and grueling battle characterized by heavy artillery barrages, close quarters combat, and determined resistance from the entrenched North Vietnamese forces. The North Vietnamese army had constructed extensive bunkers and fortifications on the hill, making it a challenging target to capture. Despite facing heavy losses and mounting criticism over the strategic insignificance of the hill, forces persisted in their efforts. So, after multiple assaults and intense fighting, the Americans eventually succeeded in securing Hill 937. However, the victory came at a high cost. Approximately 70 US soldiers lost their lives and hundreds were wounded during the battle. And to make things worse, Hill was ultimately abandoned a few weeks later, which definitely didn't help the anti-war sentiment. Finally, we have the Battle of E Drang. To end things off, we'll bring it to where it really started, the Battle of E Drang. The battle marked the first major clash between the United States Army and the North Vietnamese Army and was part of Operation Silver Bayonet. This incident involved elements of the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment led by Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore against the North Vietnamese's 66th Regiment. The E Drang Valley was chosen as a landing zone for US troops to engage and disrupt North Vietnamese operations in the area. The American forces were deployed by helicopter into landing zone X-Ray, initiating the battle. The battle was characterized by intense and fierce combat, with both sides sustaining heavy casualties. The North Vietnamese employed guerrilla tactics and utilized the dense jungle terrain to their advantage. The American soldiers faced a determined enemy, and the battle was marked by close quarters fighting and heavy casualties. Despite being outnumbered, US forces demonstrated their firepower and skills. The battle was brutal and chaotic, with soldiers facing tremendous challenges due to the unpredictable nature of combat in dense jungle terrain. The battle concluded after several days of fighting, with both sides claiming victory. The US forces managed to hold their ground and successfully repel the North Vietnamese attacks. The battle resulted in significant casualties, and still, no one would have any clue of what was to come in the years going forward. That's our list of 10 messed up stories from the Vietnam War. Thanks for watching, and for Bumblebee, I'm Ethan, and I'll see you in the next one.